First question that we have is the odd letters in the Torah, large, small, broken, etc. What is their history? My online researching has not helped me too much. Do we know when they first appeared? I've heard they go back to Moses, but I find that unlikely. An example would be the small aleph at the end of Vayikra in the first line of Leviticus. And this all has to do with the Masoretic text, right?
Right. The Masoretes begin their work, maybe sometime in the very late 5th century, but mostly beginning in the 6th century and on. Two different houses, shall we say, developed two different groups of scribes, which were called Masoretes. The Masora, the term means the tradition that's passed on. And so we wouldn't say that the Masoretic text only began in the 5th or 6th century, but the writing down of the vowels that the Masoretes developed, the written vowels, because remember in Hebrew vowels were not generally written down; they were understood orally. There were 3 or 4 consonants, mainly 3 consonants, that were used to indicate vowels, but nonetheless. In the 5th and 6th centuries, they began to write the vowels down. And why? Well, because the Jewish people were being dispersed throughout the lands of their other lands, the diaspora, and they were losing the use of Hebrew. And so it was decided that in order to retain the proper reading and pronunciation of the Hebrew, there would have to be written vowels. Well, they also began to write down at the same time various notes and different traditions with regard to the text, so that subsequent generations of scribes would be careful not to make what would have been common mistakes. Just as a quick example, if a word is spelled 2 different ways in the Tanakh or in the Old Testament, there would be notes to alert scribes to say it's spelled this way in this text, but it's spelled a different way in another area of the Tanakh. And so those kinds of notes were written down. And at the same time, some traditions began to be included into the text of the Tanakh, and that includes these different letters, some large, some small, some broken. The one that this person brings up as an example, the small aleph in the first word of Leviticus, Vayikra, ends with an aleph, and in some manuscripts this aleph is written small. And there's various traditions as to why it was written small, but even when we come to a manuscript like Leningradensis, which is dated 1008 in the colophon, and at the end of the manuscript, it indicates that it was written at this time. It does not have the small aleph. We can't check with the Aleppo Codex, which is usually dated to 996 of the Common Era, because the first 4 books of the Torah are missing. And as an aside, we hope they're going to be found, because it's very clear that they weren't burnt, as the story went. They were taken. So we don't know where they are. Recently, a year and a half or 2 years ago, one page showed up in a collection, so we know that there are. But at any rate,
somebody's hiding them in a basement. In other words, is what you're saying.
or perhaps a collector has them, or perhaps they are in a collection of manuscripts that are yet to be cataloged. I mean, we don't know.
So the Vatican is hiding them, is what you're saying.
Well, I have to say this for the Vatican. The Roman Catholic Church, while we disagree vehemently with theology and practice, they were used actually by Hashem to guard and maintain manuscripts. We're thankful for that. So who knows what's in the archives of the Vatican? But at any rate, we don't find these kinds. For instance, the small aleph, we don't find that until even later manuscripts. Now, some of the larger letters and smaller letters are found in the earlier manuscripts that we have. Interestingly, none of them are found in the Qumran scrolls, as far as I know. I haven't checked every single one, but the vast majority of them are not found. So we know that it's a later phenomena, because the Qumran scrolls are dated to the 1st century, maybe 2nd century BCE, up through the 1st century of the Common Era. And so even those manuscripts which are dated to the first century of the Common Era during the time of Yeshua and his apostles, they do not contain any of these large or small letters or broken letters, as far as I know.
So wait, hang on just a sec. So could some of these smaller letters? It's not like they screwed up. These are obviously intentional, right?
They are intentional. And the one that we most oftentimes see, because we're looking at it a lot, is in the Shema. In Deuteronomy 6:4, you have the ayin of Shema, the first word, and the dalet of echad to be large letters. So you have an ayin and a dalet, which stands for testimony or witness, if you put those two together. And so there were some of those kind of things that were used kind of like we would do in our day. And now I know not everybody does this, but some of us do. When we're reading a book, we like to underline a line, or we like to highlight it, or maybe put a little mark in the margin saying this is something I want to be able to find again. So they put these large letters at the Shema because it was a text that was going to be regularly referred to, and it could be easily found then. Remember that in the Torah Scrolls, as well as in the scrolls of the prophets and the writings, they were not broken up into chapter and verse. That happened later. And so in order to find something in the scroll, you had to read, kind of skim to find the section you wanted. And of course, many of the scribes, or at least some of them, had much of the Tanakh memorized. But just as an aside, if we think, no, that's just a myth, that no one could do that. I had the privilege of sitting next to Zion Ben Volkholder one time at the Society of Biblical Literature, a friend and colleague, I guess you could say, or at least a friend, Marty Abegg. He and I were at seminary at the same time. Was helping Dr. Volkholder move from one lecture to another because Dr. Volkholder's site was diminished, and Marty had to go read a paper, so he asked if I would take Dr. Volkholder to the next lecture, which I did. I sat next to him. It was a lecture on the Talmud, and he sat very calmly and listened to the whole lecture. And when it was finished, he corrected the reader in 4 or 5 places where he had misquoted the Talmud and or given the wrong reference. And I asked him, I said, certainly you do not have the whole Talmud in memory. And he said, well, I can't say that I would be 100% accurate, but mostly, yes, I do. And so the idea that there could be men and women who learn and memorize large amounts of text is certainly verifiable, and that seems to be the case with the scribes. So this is the Masoretic text, is the tradition passed on from generation to generation, usually within families. Did the traditions vary at times? Yes, but they were extremely concerned about the accuracy of every letter, every space, and every word. And so these traditions began to be written instead of given orally, starting sometime in maybe the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries and on from there. Which means these letters are late. They're the product of the later scribes, not something that we find in the earliest manuscripts.